The air at the Henderson Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of late summer humidity, diesel fumes, and the sweet, sad smell of rust. It was August of '72, and the feeling in the crowd was electric. Corn was over $2 a bushel and climbing, soybeans were chasing it, and every farmer in the county with a lick of ambition was there to get a piece of the action. Old Man Henderson had passed, and his children, scattered to the cities like dandelion seeds, wanted cash, not land. I was there, leaning against the fender of my '68 Ford F100, just watching. My name is Jedediah Stone. I farmed the same quarter section my grandfather broke with a team of mules. I wasn't there to buy land. Land was for men with deep pockets, or a dangerous friendship with the bank president. I was there for the iron. Not the shiny stuff, but the forgotten pieces, the parts and implements you could pick up for a song and breathe life back into with time and sweat. That's when I saw him, Richard Miller. Rich, as everyone called him, and for good reason. He was holding court near the auctioneer's stand, decked out in a brand new pair of jeans without a single grease stain on them, and a seed corn cap that looked like it had been handed to him that morning. He'd just taken delivery of a brand new International Harvester 1466, the one with the big V8 diesel and the black stripe down the hood. He'd ploughed under his neighbour's fences and was farming 1,000 acres, all of it on the bank's dime. He saw farming as a numbers game, a race to the top, and he was winning. He caught my eye and sauntered over, a smirk playing on his lips. "Jed, figured I'd see you here." Picking through the scraps again, I just nodded. "You never know what you'll find, Rich." "You ought to get with the times," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the fields. "This is a new age. Go big or go home. That old 4020 of yours belongs in a museum. You can't make money turning 4 furrows at a time." My John Deere 4020 was the last tractor my father bought before he died. It was paid for. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of fluid in it was mine. It had never failed me. I didn't say any of that. Arguing with Rich was like wrestling a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. The auctioneer moved on from the household goods to the real machinery. The bidding was fierce. A decent John Deere 7700 combine, 10 years old but well kept, went for a price that made my jaw tighten. Rich didn't even bid. He was waiting for the land. He was just there to remind everyone who was king of the hill. Then they dragged it out from behind the barn. It was a McCormick Deering threshing machine, a 2238 model from the looks of it. It must have been sitting in the weeds for 30 years. The wooden frame was grey and splintered. The sheet metal was a patchwork of rust and faded red paint, and the big drive belt lay coiled beside it like a dead snake. Birds had nested in the blower pipe. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. "What in tarnation is that thing?" someone shouted. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Gus, just grinned. "All right, boys, here's a real piece of history. Get your scrap haulers ready. What'll you give me for this antique? Let's start it at $20. Do I hear 20? Silence, then more laughter. 15. $10 to haul it away? Gus pleaded, his rhythm broken. Rich Miller let out a loud, braying laugh. Hell, Gus, you ought to pay someone to take that junk. Stone, you could probably melt it down and make a new drawbar for that relic you drive. Something inside me clicked. Maybe it was his arrogance. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon sun hit the faded lettering on the side, a ghost of a proud name. I saw my grandfather in my mind's eye, standing on a machine just like it, straw in his hair, sweat on his brow, feeding the golden wheat into its hungry mouth. This machine had fed families, it had paid for farms, it deserved better than the scrapyard. $20, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmuring. Every head turned to me. Gus's eyes widened in surprise. I got 20 from Jed Stone. Do I hear 25? Rich was staring at me, his smirk gone, replaced by a look of genuine disbelief. He looked at the thresher, then back at me, as if I'd lost my mind. $20 going once, Gus called out, eager to be rid of it. Going twice. The crowd was dead silent. They were all thinking the same thing. Jed Stone, the man who pinches every penny, was buying a pile of rotten wood and rusted steel. Sold, Gus slammed his hand down. For $20, to the man with more time than sense. The laughter that followed was louder this time, but I didn't care. I walked over to the auctioneer's clerk, pulled a worn $20 bill from my wallet, and paid for my new prize. As I signed the receipt, Rich came up behind me. "I don't get you, Stone," he said, shaking his head. "While the rest of us are trying to make a living, you're building a museum of failure. What are you going to do with that thing?" I folded the receipt and tucked it in my shirt pocket. I looked him square in the eye. "I'm going to make it run." His face twisted into a pitying smile. "You do that. While you're playing with your grandpa's toys, I'll be buying the rest of this county." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was more of a shove than a friendly pat, and walked off toward the auctioneer to register for the land bidding. Getting the Thresher home was a chore in itself. The steel wheels were seized solid with rust. I had to use a porter-power and a 20-pound sledgehammer just to break them loose enough to turn. It took 2 hours, a lot of sweat, and a string of curses that would make a sailor blush. I winched it onto my flatbed trailer, the old wood groaning in protest, and chained it down tight. The whole way home, I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me as I passed, their faces a mixture of confusion and amusement. Jed Stone had finally cracked. I backed it into the dark corner of my machine shed next to my old Farmall M. The two machines looked like they belonged together, relics from another time. My wife Sarah came out, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the Thresher, then at me. She didn't say a word, just raised an eyebrow. "It was $20, I said, as if that explained everything. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Well, it looks like your winter project just found you." That night, after Sarah and the kids were asleep, I went back out to the shed with a lantern and a notepad. The air was cool and smelled of grease and damp earth. I hung the lantern from a rafter, its yellow light pushing back the shadows and throwing the Thresher into stark relief. It was a mess. The main drive belt was shot, cracked and rotten. The straw walkers were jammed with ancient petrified chaff. Half the canvases on the raddles were torn to shreds. Every grease zerk was clogged, every bearing suspect. I spent hours just looking, touching, gently probing the machine's wounds. I ran my hand over the big cylinder, feeling the forged steel teeth. I traced the path the grain would take, from the feeder house, through the cylinder, onto the straw walkers, and down through the sieves and fans until it trickled, clean and golden, into a waiting sack. It was a simple, beautiful, mechanical marvel. It was honest. It didn't have hydraulics or electronics or a computer telling it what to do. It just worked, powered by a belt and a prayer. I sat down on an overturned bucket, the lantern light flickering, and I knew Rich Miller and all the others were wrong. This wasn't junk. This was a legacy, and I was going to bring it back. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this restoration, the long nights and busted knuckles that followed, I have to ask you folks something. Have you ever taken on a project that everyone, and I mean everyone, said was a complete waste of time, a lost cause? Maybe it was an old truck, a piece of furniture, or something else everybody else had given up on. Let me know in the comments what it was, and tell me how it turned out for you. I'm curious to know I'm not the only stubborn fool out there. That winter was one of the coldest I can remember. The wind howled across the flat Illinois prairie, piling snowdrifts against the north side of the barn and rattling the windows of the house. But inside my shop, it was a different world. I had an old barrel stove cranked up in the corner, its chimney pipe glowing a dull red. The air was thick with the smells of penetrating oil, hot metal, and coffee. My project, my $20 folly, sat in the center of the floor, slowly coming apart piece by piece. Restoring that McCormick Deering Thresher wasn't like fixing a modern machine. You couldn't just go to the dealer and order a part from a computer screen. There were no part numbers, no diagrams on a microfiche. The only guide I had was a tattered, oil-stained operator's manual I found tucked away in the toolbox, its pages as brittle as autumn leaves. My days were for chores, feeding the livestock and planning for spring planting, but my nights belonged to the Thresher. I started with the teardown, a slow, methodical process. Every nut and bolt was a battle. I'd soak them in Croil for a day, tap them gently with a ball-peen hammer to break the rust's grip, and then put a long-handled wrench to them, praying the old steel wouldn't shear off. More often than not, it did, and I'd have to get out the drill and the easy outs. The biggest challenge was the cylinder. It was the heart of the machine, the part that beat the grain from the straw. Two of the main bearings were completely seized. I couldn't press them out. They were rusted solid to the shaft and the housing. I ended up having to use the cutting torch, carefully slicing the outer race of the bearing, peeling it away layer by layer like an onion until the shaft was free. The heat and the noise were tremendous, filling the shop with a shower of orange sparks and the acrid smell of burnt grease. Finding new bearings was an adventure in itself. I spent a whole Saturday driving to every dusty, forgotten farm supply store and junkyard within a 100-mile radius. I finally found what I needed in a coffee can full of old bearings at a place outside Peoria, run by an old man who had more parts in his head than most dealers had in their inventory. He knew exactly what I needed just by looking at the old, scarred one I brought in. The woodwork was another story. The straw walkers, the big shaker racks that separated the straw from the grain, were made of ash. Several of the boards were cracked and rotten. I couldn't just replace them with any old wood. It had to be ash, strong and flexible, to withstand the constant vibration. I ended up felling a dead ash tree in my own woodlot, milling the logs on a friend's sawmill and letting the lumber cure by the stove for weeks. Then I'd spend hours with a draw knife and a spoke shave, shaping each new piece by hand, using the old broken ones as a template. It was slow, painstaking work. All the while, the talk in town continued. At the coffee shop in the morning, I'd hear the whispers. Hear Jed Stones still out in his shed, playing with that old junk pile. His wife must be a saint to put up with him. He's gonna miss the boat. Rich Miller just bought another 160 acres over by the river bottom, paid top dollar. Rich himself would drive by my place sometimes in his new Lincoln, slowing down just enough to peer into the open door of my machine shed. He never stopped, just shook his head with that same pitying look and drove on. He was the future, and I was the past. In his mind, it was that simple. Sarah was my rock. She never complained about the long hours I spent in the shop or the money I spent on parts. She'd bring me out a hot thermos of coffee and a sandwich around 9 o'clock every night. She'd stand there for a few minutes, watching me work. The quiet hum of her support, louder than all the gossip in town. "How's it coming?" she'd ask. "Slow," I'd reply, wiping grease from my hands with a rag. "But it's coming." One night I hit a wall, a big one. The main shaker crank, a heavy cast-iron piece that drove the whole separation system, had a hairline crack in it. It was almost invisible, but under the strain of operation, it would surely snap. The machine would tear itself apart. A piece like that was irreplaceable. You couldn't buy it, and you couldn't make it. My heart sank. Maybe Rich and the others were right. Maybe this was a fool's errand. I sat there for an hour, just staring at it. I thought about dragging the whole machine back out behind the barn and letting it rust in peace. But then I thought about my grandfather. He and his generation didn't just throw things away when they broke. They fixed them. They made do. They found a way. The next morning, I loaded the cracked casting into my truck and drove over to see old man Fitzwilliam. Fitz was a blacksmith, one of the last of a dying breed. His shop was a dark, cavernous place that smelled of coal smoke and history. He looked at the part, running a gnarled finger along the crack. "Brazing won't hold," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Too much vibration. We'll have to forge weld it." For the next 4 hours, I was his apprentice. I turned the crank on the big forge blower while he brought the casting up to a bright, cherry-red heat. He showed me how to use the flux, how to read the color of the metal, how to know the precise moment when it was ready. Then came the hard part. With him wielding a heavy hammer and me using a smaller one, we worked in a steady, rhythmic cadence, striking the metal, shaping it, closing the crack, fusing the iron back into one solid piece. It was the hardest physical work I had ever done. By the end, my arm felt like lead, and my ears were ringing, but the crack was gone. The casting was whole again. "That'll hold till the end of time," Fitz said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt floor. He charged me $5. As I drove home, the repaired casting sitting on the seat beside me like a trophy, I knew I had turned a corner. I wasn't just fixing a machine anymore. I was preserving a skill, a way of thinking. I was proving to myself that the old ways still had value. The community could laugh all they wanted. Rich Miller could buy the whole world on credit. I was building something that was truly mine, with my own two hands. And when it was done, it wouldn't owe a dime to anyone. The spring of '73 arrived, and with it, the planting season. I put the Thresher project on hold and turned my attention to the fields. That year, the rain came at the right time, the sun shone when we needed it, and the corn grew tall and green. By the mid-'70s, the whole country was riding a wave of agricultural prosperity. Russia was buying American grain by the boatload, and prices shot through the roof. The government was telling us to plant fence row to fence row, and everyone was listening. The mood in the heartland was pure gold rush. For men like Rich Miller, it was the vindication of every risk he'd ever taken. The massive loans he'd taken out for land and equipment were suddenly manageable. He was a genius. He bought another tractor, a monstrous four-wheel drive Steiger, and a 24-row planter to go with it. He tore down his old farmhouse and built a new brick ranch-style house on a hill overlooking his land, with a 3-car garage and a paved driveway. He was the embodiment of the new American farmer, a businessman whose crop was money. His operation was a sight to behold. At night, his fields were lit up like a city. The big halogen lights on his tractors and combines cutting through the darkness as he worked around the clock. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres now, all of it leveraged to the hilt. The bankers loved him. They'd drive out to his farm in their fancy cars, shake his hand and offer him more money. He was their poster boy. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. The good prices were a blessing for me too, but I saw them differently. I didn't see them as a ticket to get bigger. I saw them as a chance to get stronger. I didn't buy more land. I didn't buy a new tractor. Instead, I paid off the last of my father's operating loan at the bank. I took the extra profits and put them into the farm itself. I tiled a low spot in the West 40 that had always been too wet. I built new fences. I spread lime and potash, building up the soil my son would one day inherit. And I put a chunk of cash into a savings account at the credit union, not the big bank, tucking it away for a rainy day. In the coffee shop, they called me timid. "Jed's too scared to take a chance," they'd say. "He's content being a small-timer. He's going to get left behind." Rich would just smile and say, "Some people are content with mediocrity." To them, my debt-free operation wasn't a sign of prudence. It was a sign of failure, a lack of vision. That summer, after the corn was laid by, I finished the Thresher. I painted it the original McCormick Deering red and cream, using the faint traces of old paint as my guide. I stenciled the logos back on, just as they had been 50 years before. I bought a new canvas belt, 150 feet of it, thick and heavy. When it was all done, I rolled it out of the shed into the sunlight. It wasn't a pile of junk anymore, it was magnificent. My first test was the oat crop. Oats weren't a big cash crop anymore, most farmers had stopped growing them. But I still planted 10 acres every year for livestock feed and straw bedding. Usually, I'd just hire a neighbor with a combine, but not this year. I belted the Thresher to my old Farmall M, the tractor my dad had bought new after the war. The M wasn't powerful like the 4020, but it had a perfect belt pulley and could govern its speed down to a steady rhythm. It took half the day to get everything set just right, to get the cylinder speed matched to the engine RPMs, to adjust the sieves and the fan. It took a crew to run it, the way it was always done. I had my son, young Tom, pitching bundles from the wagon onto the feeder. I had Sarah bagging the grain as it came out of the spout. I had a neighbor kid stacking the bags. It was slow, hot, dusty work, the air filled with the hum of the machine, the chuffing of the Farmall's exhaust, and the smell of fresh straw. Rich Miller drove by as we were working. He stopped his air-conditioned pickup at the end of the lane and just watched us for a long time. We were a living history exhibit. A man, a woman, and a boy, working in the heat with a machine from a forgotten era. I could see him shaking his head before he put the truck in gear and sped off in a cloud of dust. To him, we must have looked like fools, wasting a perfectly good afternoon on a handful of oats when there was real money to be made. But as I watched the clean, heavy grain pour into the sacks and saw the mountain of bright, perfect straw piling up from the blower, I didn't feel like a fool. The grain was cleaner than any combine could have made it, and the straw was long and unbroken, perfect for bedding. We weren't just harvesting a crop, We were part of a process, a tradition. We were tired and dirty, but we were satisfied. That evening, as the sun set, I stood by the quiet Thresher, a cold beer in my hand. The farm was quiet. My land, my machines, my home. It was all mine. No banker could ever take it away. I looked across the section to the west, where the lights on Rich Miller's new Steiger were already blazing, tearing through another field of soybeans. He was running hard, running fast, chasing the horizon. But I'd been listening to the news on the radio, whispers from Washington about inflation getting out of control, talk of the Federal Reserve having to take action. The old-timers at the feed mill were talking about the 20s, how the boom had turned to bust in the blink of an eye. I looked at the string of lights on the horizon, at that massive debt-fueled operation, and a cold knot formed in my stomach. The good times felt a little too good, a little too easy. And I knew deep down in my bones that a storm was coming. The end of the 70s felt like a long, hot afternoon that wouldn't quit. Grain prices stayed high, land values kept climbing, and the banks were practically giving money away. Rich Miller's operation had swollen to over 3,000 acres. He had a line of credit that was talked about in hushed, reverent tones at the coffee shop. He traded in his 1466 for 2 brand-new International 2+2 tractors, those strange-looking articulated machines that looked like 2 tractors stuck together. He was on the cover of a farm magazine, standing in front of his new grain leg, smiling like a king surveying his empire. He was the very picture of success. I kept my course. I farmed my quarter section and rented another 80 from a widow down the road. My son Tom was in high school now, and he was good with a wrench, better with a welder. Together we kept the 4020 and the old Farmall M in perfect running order. The Thresher sat in the shed, a monument to a winter's obsession, oiled and ready, though I hadn't used it for much besides a few acres of oats each year. It was a conversation piece, a curiosity. The laughter had mostly died down, replaced by a sort of quiet, head-shaking acceptance. That was just Jed Stone, the man who farmed in the past. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was a whisper on the wind. It was the winter of 1980. The news came over the radio, crackling through the speakers in the barn as I milked our 2 cows. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The biggest buyer of American corn and soybeans was gone overnight. The markets panicked. The price of corn, which had been flirting with $4 a bushel, collapsed. It fell $1 in a week. At the coffee shop, the mood turned sour. The same men who had been bragging about the new land they'd bought were now hunched over their cups, staring into them as if looking for answers. Rich Miller was there, but the confident swagger was gone. He was talking loudly, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "It's a blip," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "A political game. They'll be buying again in 6 months. We just have to ride it out." But his eyes were tight with worry. Riding it out required cash flow, and his cash flow was tied to a price that no longer existed. Then the sky turned against us. The spring of 80 was dry. The summer that followed was a scorcher. The rains never came. The sun beat down relentlessly, day after day, baking the black earth into a cracked grey brick. Corn leaves curled up tight, trying to hold on to what little moisture they had, turning a sickly pale green. The soybeans in the fields just stopped growing, their pods thin and flat. It was a full-blown drought, the worst since the 50s. The combination was devastating. We had a short crop and a low price. It was a farmer's nightmare. For me, it was a hard punch to the gut. I knew my yields would be cut in half, maybe more. My income would be down, but my expenses were low. I had no debt payments to make. I would tighten my belt, dip into the savings I'd tucked away, and I would survive. For Rich Miller, it was a cannonball to the hull of his magnificent overloaded ship. The first real crack appeared in late October. Rich was trying to get his drought-stunted soybeans out of the field. He was running a massive International 1480 axial flow combine, the newest rotary model, a machine that cost more than my entire farm was worth. I was out in my own field with my old John Deere 7700, the same model I'd seen sell for a fortune at the Henderson auction years ago. Mine was older, but it was paid for, and I knew every inch of it. I saw Rich's combine stop in the middle of his field, right across the road. It just sat there, its big, unloading auger pointed at the sky like a silent accusation. It didn't move for the rest of the day. The next morning, a dealer's service truck was parked beside it. I saw them pulling a big hydraulic pump off the side, a complex piece of equipment with a dozen hoses snaking out of it. Later that week, I saw the mechanic at the parts store. "What happened to Miller's combine?" I asked. He shook his head, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Main hydraulic pump went out. Took the hydrostatic drive with it. It's a $5,000 part, and there isn't one in the state. We've got one on order from the factory, but with the strike going on in Moline, who knows when we'll see it? Could be 2 weeks." 2 weeks. With the weather turning and the beans getting drier and more brittle by the day, 2 weeks was an eternity. Every day that Combine sat silent, Rich was losing money. Not just from the repair bill, but from the crop he couldn't harvest. I looked out at his fields, 1,000 acres of soybeans waiting, and I thought about the interest payment on that machine, on that land, ticking away every single second, whether the wheels were turning or not. The king's empire was starting to look like a house of cards in a rising wind. The wind became a hurricane. Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, declared war on inflation. He jacked up interest rates to heights nobody had ever seen. The prime rate, the number the banks based everything on, climbed to 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. For anyone with a variable rate loan, and that was nearly every farmer who had expanded in the 70s, it was a death sentence. Rich Miller's operating loans, his land payments, his equipment notes, they were all tied to that prime rate. The friendly banker who had encouraged him to use our money to make money was gone, replaced by a grim-faced man from the regional office in Chicago. The letters started coming, first polite, then firm, then demanding. The numbers were staggering. Rich's monthly interest payments alone were more than I cleared in a good year. The whole community was in a state of shock. It was like a plague sweeping across the prairie. Farm auction notices started appearing in the paper, 1 or 2 at first, then a dozen. These weren't retirement sales, they were foreclosure auctions. "By order of the Farmers and Merchants Bank," the flyers read. Good men, good farmers I had known my whole life were losing everything their fathers and grandfathers had built. The coffee shop fell silent. There was nothing left to say. The talk of expansion and new iron was replaced by whispered fears of bankruptcy. Rich Miller held on longer than most. He fought it with everything he had. He sold off some of his newer equipment at a loss, trying to raise cash. He tried to refinance, but no bank would touch him. The land he'd paid $4,000 an acre for was now appraised at less than $2,000. He was upside down by millions. The end came in the fall of '82. The auction notice was a full page in the county paper. It listed it all: 3,200 acres of prime Illinois farmland, the brick ranch house on the hill, 2 2+2 tractors, the 1480 combine, the 24-row planter, the entire kingdom, all to be sold on the courthouse steps. I went to the auction. I felt like I had to. The crowd was different from the one at the Henderson sale a decade earlier. There were no hopeful young farmers, no electricity in the air. It was a gathering of vultures, bankers in suits, out-of-state investors, and grim-faced neighbors hoping to pick up a piece of land for cheap. Rich was there, standing beside his wife. He looked 10 years older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He wasn't wearing a new seed corn cap. He wore an old, sweat-stained hat pulled down low. He saw me in the crowd, and his eyes met mine for a brief moment. There was no arrogance left in them, no pity. There was only shame. I didn't bid on the big tracts of land or the massive equipment. I couldn't afford them, and I didn't want them. But I waited. Toward the end of the sale, they put up the original Miller home place, the 160 acres his grandfather had homesteaded, the land where Rich had grown up. The bidding was slow. It was too small for the big investors. I raised my hand. I bid what I knew it was worth, what a man could make a living on. Another farmer bid against me once, but he dropped out. The auctioneer's gavel fell. Sold to Jedediah Stone. The land was mine, but as I walked over to sign the paperwork, I felt no sense of victory. I just felt a deep, profound sadness for the man who had lost it all. The American dream had turned into a nightmare right before our eyes. I survived, not because I was smarter, but because I was scared. My fear of debt had been my salvation, the thing they had all mocked me for. My caution, my refusal to chase the horizon, had been the very thing that kept my feet on solid ground while the world washed away around me. The drought of '80 was followed by the drought of '83. The weather patterns had shifted, and the reliable summer rains we had built our lives around were gone. That year, the soybeans were even shorter and more fragile than before. The few pods that formed were brittle, and the stems were like wire. Modern combines, with their high-speed rotary threshers, were a disaster. They were too aggressive. I watched my neighbors' fields, and the ground behind their big machines was littered with shattered beans. They were losing a third of their crop right on the ground, a loss no one could afford with prices in the tank. My own 7700 was doing the same thing. I slowed it down, opened up the concave, throttled back the fan, but it was no use. The cylinder was just too rough on the delicate crop. I came home one evening, covered in dust and despair, and sat at the kitchen table, my head in my hands. We were going to lose the farm, not to the bank, but to the weather. Sarah put a cup of coffee in front of me. "What's wrong, Jed?" "It's the beans," I said. "They're shattering. The combine is beating them to pieces." We sat in silence for a moment, then she looked out the window toward the machine shed, where the setting sun glinted off the red paint of the old McCormick Deering thresher. "What about that thing?" she asked quietly. I looked at her, then back toward the shed. An idea, so crazy it just might work, began to form in my mind. The thresher wasn't aggressive. It used a cylinder with peg teeth and a series of slow-moving straw walkers to gently shake the grain free. It was designed for fragile crops like oats and wheat. The next morning, Tom and I were in the shop. We couldn't pull the thresher through the field. We had no way to get the short-cut beans into it. So we decided to bring the beans to the thresher. We took the header off the 7700 and used the combine just to cut the beans and convey them into a silage wagon. Then we hauled the wagons back to the farmstead and set up a stationary threshing operation, just like my grandfather had done. We belted the thresher to the old Farmall M. We set up an auger to feed the whole plants into the feeder house and another auger to carry the clean grain away from the bagging spout. It took a full day to get it all rigged up. The whole time, neighbors drove by, slowing down to stare at the bizarre scene. Jed Stone was at it again, trying to farm with museum pieces. When we were finally ready, I took a deep breath and throttled up the Farmall. The long belt tightened, the big flywheel on the thresher began to turn, and the whole machine came to life with a low, rhythmic hum. Tom started the auger, and the first load of dry, brittle soybean plants tumbled into the machine's mouth. For a moment, it choked and sputtered. Then the rhythm caught. The straw walkers began their dance, the sieves shivered back and forth, and from the grain spout, a trickle of clean, whole, perfect soybeans began to pour out. I ran my hands through them. They were beautiful. I walked to the back of the machine where the straw and empty pods were being blown out. I sifted through the pile on the ground. I found maybe 1 or 2 beans. The loss was almost zero. It worked. It actually worked. Word got around fast. My neighbor to the west, the one who'd lost a third of his crop, came over that evening. He stood there for a long time, watching the strange contraption work, watching the pile of clean beans grow. "Jed," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "can you do my beans next?" "We can try," I said. For the next 3 weeks, we ran that old thresher day and night. We threshed my beans, then my neighbor's, then the neighbor on the other side. We set up lights and worked in shifts. It was slow, laborious work, but we were saving our farms. The $20 junk pile had become the most valuable machine in the county. One afternoon, a dusty pickup truck I didn't recognize pulled into the lane. A man got out. It was Rich Miller. He was thinner, and his face was lined with a weariness that went bone deep. He had lost the big house, but I'd heard he and his wife were living in a small tenant house on a farm he was now working as a hired hand. He walked over, avoiding my eyes, and watched the thresher work. "I heard what you were doing," he said finally, his voice raspy. I didn't believe it. "It's not fast," I said, "but it's saving the crop." He nodded, kicking at a clod of dirt. He looked beaten. "Jed, I need to ask you something, and you have every right to tell me to go to hell." He swallowed hard. "The man I'm working for, he's got 100 acres of beans just like these. He was going to just disc them under. Is there any chance, could you—" I looked at this man who had once stood on top of the world and mocked me for being small. I saw the desperation in his eyes, the crushing weight of his failure, and I felt no triumph, only a shared humanity. We were both just farmers trying to make a living from the dirt. "Tell you what, Rich," I said. "We're short-handed here. My boy is worn out. I could use a man who knows how to run an auger and move wagons. It pays $4 an hour." Tears welled in his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just nodded, a quick, jerky motion. He showed up for work the next morning before the sun was up, and he worked harder than anyone. We threshed his boss's beans, and we saved them. That winter, I went to see Rich. I found him in the drafty little house they were renting. I sat at his kitchen table and pushed a piece of paper across to him. It was a lease agreement. "It's for your old home place," I said. "The original 160. The rent is a third of the crop, just like in the old days. You can build back from there. It's good land. It'll be good to you." He stared at the paper, then at me. "Why, Jed? After everything?" "Why?" "Because this community needs good farmers," I said. "And you were one of the best. You just flew a little too close to the sun." Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The farm crisis burned itself out, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the people. The ones who survived were the ones who were cautious, the ones who had managed their debt. My way of farming wasn't seen as timid anymore, it was seen as wise. Young farmers would stop by, not to look at new equipment catalogues, but to ask how I kept my old machinery running, how I managed my books, how I knew when to borrow and when to save. Rich took the lease. He and his wife moved back into his old family farmhouse. He farmed that 160 acres with a fierce determination. He bought an old John Deere 4010, the precursor to my 4020, and fixed it up himself. We became friends in a quiet, unspoken way. We'd help each other during harvest, share coffee, and talk about the weather. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hard-won humility. Years passed. My son Tom took over more of the day-to-day work on the farm. I found myself spending more time in the shop, this time with my grandson, Ben, at my side. He had the same spark in his eye that I did, a love for the old iron. One Saturday afternoon, we were in the shed, and Ben was looking at the old McCormick Deering Thresher. It sat in its corner, cleaned and oiled, a silent testament. "Grandpa," he asked, "why do you keep this old thing? It's so old." I knelt down beside him and put my hand on the big flywheel, its cast iron cool to the touch. "I keep it to remember something important, Ben," I said. "This machine doesn't have a computer. It doesn't have a big engine. It can't do the work of those big new combines. But it's honest, and it's paid for." I looked at him, hoping he would understand. "Out there," I said, gesturing toward the world beyond our farm, "people will tell you that you have to be bigger and faster and have the newest of everything. They'll tell you to borrow money to get it. But you remember this machine. It's not about how much you have. It's about how much you owe. What you own, truly own, nobody can ever take from you. That's your foundation. That's what will see you through the storm." He nodded, his young face serious, and ran his small hand over the faded red paint. I stood up and looked out the open door of the machine shed. I could see my fields, green and healthy, stretching out to meet the horizon. I could see the farmhouse my grandfather built, the barn my father raised, the land that had sustained my family for 3 generations. It wasn't an empire. It wasn't the biggest farm in the county. But it was mine. And in the quiet satisfaction of that thought, I knew I had everything a man could ever want.